Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Kaylee McNamara. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much again for joining us. This episode is going to be a really special episode because I get to speak with my amazing colleague and friend, NCOSE's President and CEO, Dr. Marcel Vanderwaat. Marcel, thanks so much for joining us for this episode.
I'm very excited. It's great to be here with you, Hayley, and thanks for doing such an awesome job with this podcast.
It's been fun. It's been fun doing it. There's always something new to talk about, every week, which is pretty amazing. And I'm excited to talk this episode with you, learn just a bit more about you because you've been with NCOSE for a while, but haven't been as public facing as long as some others on the team. So I think people will be excited to hear more about your lens and the approach and vision for NCOSE moving forward. For people who are listening, since this is a podcast, they're often hearing you, so they might have already detected that you have an accent. Could you share a bit about where you're from?
Sure.
What it was like growing up, kind of the origin story?
Sure. Well, it's not Australia. It's not New Zealand. It's not the UK. It's South Africa. So I grew up in apartheid era South Africa. My dad was a policeman. He was my hero. And I think it was 4 or 5 years old when, the dream already started. I'll follow in the footsteps of my dad. So that's where I grew up. And yeah.
That's great. And so you entered kind of into the police force. Were you immediately working on sexual exploitation issues, or how did you get into working on those issues?
Sure. So after school, right, I was a soldier for a year. I joined the military, and this was in 1998. And I think that was the first time where I at least heard, well, obviously, retrospectively, I now know what we were speaking about was human trafficking, but about how women and children and sometimes dead bodies was transported over the border from neighboring countries into South Africa, and that's how they trafficked drugs. But it was later, 4 years later, in the police, on about June 2002, that I, just was accosted with and start dealing with all things sexual exploitation as a frontline policeman. So that's where the first exposure was to these issues. And there's not been a day since then that I have not in one way, shape, or form worked with or spoke about or advocated on these issues that we worked with. So
yeah. And so it sounds like at the beginning you were doing investigations and work more in the drug trafficking space, and then just started learning more about.
Well, interestingly, because we always talk about the inextricable link, right, between all things, and you brought up the issue of drugs. So in 2002, I was a frontline policeman. So I was a guy in uniform. I was with a specialized unit, and that's kind of a reaction unit, kind of more tactically trained, reacting to priority crimes in uniform. So, and priority crimes would usually be those cases that was in progress. There's a robbery in progress. We did a lot of car chases and high-speed chases and shootings and too much of all of that stuff. But part of that job was often police actions at brothels. Sometimes there was, whether it was a murder or a rape, or you would have a search warrant, and you would go into these places and drugs, guns, everything linked with the sex trade. And that was where I was first kind of came across the issue of the sex trade and what it is and what it is definitely not. So, yeah.
And its ties with organized crime, because I know that you have a special issue of a journal coming out about this, but you were seeing that in real time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This false dichotomy between linear cases of, sex trafficking and organized crime. I mean, they are all part of the same system, right? And that's why we talk about sexual exploitation, the system of prostitution, because these are all systems of systems of systems, and
Mm.
each one of them have their own different subsystems, but they all overlap and reinforce one another. And the drug trade, money laundering, I've dealt with financing related things on the
Mm.
African continent. It's all inextricably linked. It's a business. Now, we're not talking about organized crime like it used to look like in the 1940s, like these hierarchies. You've got the big bad guy right at the top and all the lieutenants. It's kind of a little pyramid.
Yeah.
And, nowadays, all loosely connected networks, and it's different pipelines of criminal commodities. So, yeah.
Of different commodities. So then in that kind of sex trafficking would be the like a financial revenue
Yeah,
for a
people.
criminal network.
People,
Yeah.
people as a commodity,
Hmm.
drugs, firearms, stolen goods.
Hmm.
It also interspersed with retail crime. I think there's so many things that we still don't talk about, even here, where criminal exploitation, we know like human trafficking, there's different forms of exploitation.
Hmm.
Two big categories, obviously labor and sexual exploitation, but there's also criminal exploitation where people are used as, trafficking drugs, breaking into homes, street level robberies. Many of those are trafficking victims,
Hmm.
that have been mobilized to commit these crimes.
Hmm.
Sometimes little kids, 7, 8 years old, maybe not for sexual exploitation, but they can climb through a window to break into a
Yeah.
house. They are trafficked. It's a different form of trafficking. But again, it's all so interconnected. And I just think these false dichotomies is just dislodged from reality.
Yeah, you have to look at it holistically to be able to dismantle it, really.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
that's so fascinating. So that's kind of the lens where you started learning more about these issues. I mean, seeing these issues in real time and dismantle, I guess is the word, trying to take apart these networks
Mm.
from a law enforcement standpoint. As you were entering this space more and more, did you see on the ground in your work a huge difference between prostitution and sex trafficking? That's something at National Center on Sexual Exploitation. As you know, we talk about how people will try to separate those as completely different. Did at the time, did you think that they were completely different? How did that look?
Great. So obviously, I think we all have a story how the scales ultimately fall from our eyes,
Mhm.
right? So there was a point where I was in many ways, um, and I'm going to qualify what I mean by being part of the problem is, in South Africa, where everything is criminalized, back in 2002, we would, in the middle of a week, when things are quiet and as a tactical team, we don't have many, there's not a bank robbery or there's not robberies, in progress, we would literally arrest people in prostitution
Mhm.
en masse.
Mm.
So I'm talking about booking out a truck and then whatever people are on the street selling sex or being exploited,
Mhm.
because the law is very clear, it's prostitution and you to
So you're
enforce the law.
juveniles, the view,
Yeah,
yeah.
they are criminals. So we would arrest people in prostitution en masse, right? But even at that point in time, I was already working with, in brothels, doing raids and all of these things. But it was only when I read a IOM, it's International Organization
Mhm.
for a Migration newsletter in 2003 that I realized, but they are talking about human trafficking. And then obviously retrospectively, it was like, oh my goodness, I'm
Mhm.
arresting the wrong people here,
Mhm.
So it's kind of becoming more cognizant about what the problem looks like. But to your question, again, it's these false categories that we create, and prostitution and sex trafficking, from my experience, has always been inextricably linked. It's
Mhm.
impossible to separate them. The people who purchase people, women and children, they care precious little, really, whether it's an adult and whether it's a child, and the same things with traffickers. They do that without compunction, and people buy women and children without compunction.
Yeah.
So it's the
Mhm.
same system, and the same physical, sexual, psychological harms. That's
Yeah.
just woven into that.
Yeah, absolutely. That we talk about that a lot at NCOSE about
Yeah,
the harms, how it's harmful to everyone who's in the sex trade. But that's interesting too that you mentioned sex buyers, which is what we mean by demand,
yeah,
because they're fueling it. And it's so fascinating too, thinking about that from an organized crime. Is like the sex buyers are not only fueling the continued exploitation and abuse of
exactly.
people, but then often their money is probably being funneled up into criminal
Absolutely.
networks as well, and funding all kinds of different crimes and untold harms there.
Mm,
And so you kind of got that newsletter, you realize maybe we're arresting the wrong people.
mm,
Did I think very often when people are thinking about sex trafficking, they think, well, we need to go after the traffickers,
mm,
which is true. But it's a smaller movement, although growing very rapidly, that's recognizing we need to have accountability for the sex
mm,
buyers who are fueling this. Did you kind of immediately did that intuitively resonate for you as you were working in law enforcement? How did
mm.
your thoughts on that evolve?
That was also a process, you
Hmm.
know. It was also a process for me to realize, you know, I think I always think there's this spectrum of complicity and blameworthiness. And then obviously how the rule of law and how criminal act kind of criminal acts are defined. So back in the day, in the early 2000s up to the mid 2000s, sex buyers were kind of a byproduct of, the problem. And it was increasingly, as I then went into becoming a, sexual offences investigator, sex trafficking investigator, you realize that, again, the residue of sex buyers is dispersed throughout the system.
Hmm.
And, obviously, the more you come across these cases, you do realize that without these people purchasing sexual access to other people, overwhelmingly women and children, the market forces would not be there. So it's
Yeah.
these market forces that they create that enables the roles of pimps and traffickers to exist.
Hmm.
So there would be no traffickers and pimps and other third party actors if it was not for, the dollars that are paid by sex buyers.
Yeah.
So, but again, it was a process that unfolded for me to really have a distilled understanding in terms of that this is ultimately where the buck can stop, and it is with the sex buyers,
Yeah.
right? So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And did you see the issue of pornography crop up as you were doing investigations, especially on the human trafficking side?
Mm,
I just have current news headlines running through my mind about how pornography is often linked with exploitation, like the Epstein case, and
mm,
was recordings of victims. And so I think, people think, oh, pornography and sex trafficking, how are those things connected?
mm,
It doesn't always seem intuitive to people right away, but there's a lot of different ways it's connected.
mm.
Did you like see that as your investigations were going, recordings happening of abuse?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hmm.
Absolutely. No, again, it's just such a critical part of the infrastructure. I mean, it's just a key part of the mechanism that allows the not just prostitution, but the entire sex trade
Hmm.
to run, right? It's part of the engine. And I saw that very early on. I mean, now over the last 23 years, I've been in hundreds, like literally hundreds of brothels, and the overwhelming majority, and many parts of the world,
Hmm.
I've been in these places, and uh, and in the overwhelming majority of them, as soon as you enter the brothel, or even just in the corridors in the room, there's just pornography
Hmm.
playing. That's just the one way that it's connected, is
Yeah.
pornography, and just kind of just allowing that inhibitions just to fall by the wayside. And I've always seen, I remember so many times sitting in some of these places having conversations with, whether it's a trafficker or a pimp or a sex buyer coming in, or having a drink with somebody at the bar. I think it's one of the most toxic concoctions is pornography playing alcohol and drugs. That
Mm.
it's an incredibly potent mix. How somebody would come in sober, somebody that's never been in a brothel,
Mhm.
could be an 18, 19-year-old, it could be a 30-year-old coming into a brothel, a male person, very shy and kind of, and then there's pornography playing, there's alcohol starts flowing, drugs being used, and how that person within a moment's, like in an hour, turns into a whole different being,
Wow.
extremely violent.
Yeah.
Something, and I've interviewed some of these people,
Hmm.
a day or two later, say, I never thought I was able to do things that I did. So that's just one way, but I mean, also just as part of my investigation, looking for missing people,
Hmm.
in so many of these brothels and in the homes of traffickers, there's and obviously, I worked back in the day when there was still CDs, compact
Hmm.
discs. I'm not sure if everybody still knows what those are. They're like these little round,
Yeah.
silver things,
Shiny.
shiny
Yeah.
things. But and some of these brothels and homes of traffickers had hundreds and even thousands of these things. And so in some of my investigations, I was looking for a missing minor. And because some of these traffickers would create amateur pornography and there's a market for that, unfortunately, there were times that I had to literally go through, and some of my colleagues would have to literally sit through hours of
Oh,
watching these things to identify
identify them.
possible
Yeah.
victims of
And law enforcement
trafficking.
still has to do that. I mean, in the States,
In
you
many
know,
ways, look, I
yeah,
think artificial intelligence plays a major
it
role
helps.
now in simplifying and streamlining those tasks, and obviously protecting law enforcement from having to view this stuff, because some of those images are still sealed
Yes.
into my mind.
Yeah.
It's like 20 years later,
Hmm.
but I can still see it. I remember so much of that
Yeah.
stuff. But the point being, it's fundamental again, like prostitution, it's inextricably linked. Drugs, alcohol, these are all the fuel that kind of
Mhm.
keeps the exploitation engine going. So pornography, absolutely.
Yeah, just seamlessly interwoven, it sounds like. And it's
Mhm,
fascinating too, because my background and approach to this is not nearly so visceral. I've
mm,
come at much more by learning about the issues
mm,
versus seeing them play out in real life through
mm,
investigations. And so I would learn that there's so much research that just undergirds everything that you're saying about how
mm,
pornography does fuel demand
mm,
for purchasing sex. There's been studies on this, people who view it, not obviously not everyone who views pornography goes on to purchase sex, but that
mm,
on the whole, there's more likelihood that someone might. And I've spoken with survivors who talk about men needing to use pornography before
oh,
buying, it being used on that rent. And so it's just very fascinating to hear
mm,
how some of these businesses that are built up around it, quote unquote businesses, are almost that's like research on longitudinal research over 10 years looking at the trends of someone's life, but these businesses have it like refined. We're like, oh,
oh,
if you include that
absolutely.
plus alcohol and some drugs, you can just speed up that process for an
Absolutely.
individual. That's so
Absolutely.
interesting.
And there's no universe in the world where these businesses or these pornography platforms are not intimately aware
Yeah.
of what the configuration of substances, visual, audio, is that creates a
Hmm.
monster
Yeah.
that would rob someone else's dignity. They are so attuned to all of this.
Hmm.
And just the other thing is, that I've just also realized is that people act out what they see.
Yeah.
And I'm a skeptic of so much of the research out there, and I could qualify why I am, as myself as a researcher as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've seen, I mean, things like coprophilia and europhilia, foreign object insertion. In 2019, I consulted in a case which was called for as an expert witness, and just obviously, just a trigger warning there,
Hmm.
but there was this young girl where she had the same sex buyer coming to her. He wasn't able to have an erection, so he would use a beer bottle, as a foreign object insertion there, but also just, he had a thing for ice. So he would bring a packet of ice and he would request this young girl to insert ice blocks,
Hmm.
in his
Hmm.
anus. So where do you get that stuff?
Yeah.
You don't, you can't script this.
Yeah.
The only script for this is pornography,
Yeah.
Another one that was not able to have becoming aroused without wearing a motorcycle helmet.
So
It's
interesting.
fascinating
Yeah.
stuff, fascinating, not in a
Yes, not in
bad
a
way.
positive way.
And
Yeah,
so that's what pornography
it
does.
does.
And I
Yeah.
think today we are seeing the chickens coming home to roost. I mean, we now see parents sometimes, there was a lot of this in the media up about a year or two ago, where parents take their kids to these shows where people unclothe and strip, and little girls, two boys, 2, 3 year old, giving over $1 or paying for these people to
Yeah.
undress. And now the question is, how old were these parents when pornography exploded?
Hmm.
Internet pornography. If you think about 2004, 2005, 2006, when all of this exploded, that's the ages of these parents today who are taking their kids to these shows.
Yeah.
It's pornography. I
Yeah.
think so much of the issues we are dealing with,
Absolutely. And we've been talking about that on the podcast, an episode or a couple of episodes ago. Danny and I were talking about some of that research about how pornography does really shape
yeah,
sexual attitudes and interests, and especially with the rise of choking has been
yeah.
a really big issue that is really tied to trends that are being normalized in pornography.
Mm,
And I think another piece of what you were sharing that really stands out to me is uh, recordings of abuse. Like
mm,
I mean, literally looking through CDs for a missing child and how that
mm,
is still happening
mm,
now. I mean, we have active lawsuits against it. Now it's maybe uploaded online, but
mm,
abuse is still recorded and then shared even within mainstream pornography
mm,
platforms. And I think people just have this thought, well, if it's
mm,
on a camera, everyone must be consenting and everyone
mm.
must be so thrilled to be there. And I think too, and I don't know if you saw this in your investigations, I was speaking with a reporter actually the other day from a different country who's asking me, and she was saying, like, oh, well, all these women appear to be consenting, they're smiling on the camera, so I'm sure it's all fine. And I was saying,
Mm,
dude, part of what they have to do is to have a fantasy experience for the buyer
mm,
that they're happy to be there. Not always, but a lot of
mm.
the times I think traffickers and pimps instruct women to act interested to be there,
Oh, yeah.
right?
And
And
I have not been on a scene like that,
mhm.
but
Yeah.
what I do know from brothel owners who make their brothels available for pornography scenes, and where traffic victims are actually used. I've
Mm,
spoken to so many of these actors and people where some of these scenes, people think, well, it's a 7 minute or a 10 minute video of a sexual encounter, which looks very consensual and everybody's excited. I've spoken to people that say that 10-minute scene was recorded over 3 days.
oh,
And part of that is making sure that the scarring and the makeup is redone, and that it just looks like this prolonged video where there was multiple incidents happening,
mhm.
trauma related
Yeah.
incidents
Of being abused,
of
but they
being
cut that out.
abused and
Yeah.
actually being assaulted,
Hmm.
being threatened,
Yeah.
while you need another shot of drugs because you're not smiling anymore. I've heard this on more than one occasion
Yeah.
where people, brothel owners specifically, who sat on some of these, said, well, it takes some of these, scenes takes about 2 or 3 days to record.
Wow.
You see 10 minutes or 15 minutes of it, but, so I think there's always hidden transcripts to this,
Hmm.
and I don't think the viewers understands how many pages
Mm.
are there in these hidden transcripts and what they actually, because they tell a vastly different story in terms of what people see on the screen. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. And in your work, because you started, I mean, police work, when I hear police, I think fairly local, but then it seems like as you worked on more organized crime, your work got more
Mm.
international in general. Just over the course of your time working on these issues, how did you see different like social vulnerabilities impact people regarding sexual exploitation? At different times we talk about how important it is that our
Mm.
movement protects all people
Yeah,
from
yeah.
sexual abuse and exploitation, whatever their status, religion, age, gender, race, all of these different kind of factors. Did you see those different factors impact people,
Yes.
maybe make them more vulnerable in
Yeah,
different cases. Yeah.
absolutely. I do think that there are predisposing vulnerabilities, and I always use the difference between vulnerability and acute vulnerabilities.
Mm,
Now, it's kind of, I make sense of things, but I mean, vulnerabilities are, some of the things that research is very, very, very evident on. A lot of it is, I mean, we recently had a webinar on the issue of, you know, uh, the Black community
mm,
and sex trafficking. So I think vulnerabilities include, it's a host of things that I've seen over my career. It's, obviously poverty and homelessness and lack of schooling, all of these things. But the LGBTQ community, very, very evident, very rife. And
mhm,
I have seen, and again, this is in my work, and I've seen this especially in Cape Town, South Africa. I've seen this as well, where there is a large population of the LGBT community, and how you have sex tourism, sex tourists directly targeting a specific community because
mm,
they are perceived as more vulnerable, not, for a variety of reasons, whichever
mhm,
the predator makes sense in their own minds. But I have seen that they
yeah.
are targeted, targeting specific communities like that community. Also, because of a lack of reporting of crimes
Yeah.
by police, which is not receptive always of crimes being reported, whether it is the LGBT community or whether it's other vulnerabilities, so yes, I think research is
Mhm,
very clear in terms of what the spectrum of these vulnerabilities are. And I always say vulnerability is that there's at least a wall. The bad guy, the predator can jump over that wall. Acute vulnerabilities, there's literally nothing. And I
mm,
think and I think that's usually when there's a kind of a confluence of vulnerabilities, which usually includes, a social circumstance, economic circumstance, being pregnant,
mm,
being undocumented,
yeah.
being a child. These are acute vulnerabilities, and especially when they overlap, there is, that's usually where predators pounce.
Yeah, they
So,
try to intentionally
oh yeah,
target that. And so your work is very interesting because you have this very, I don't want to say tactile, but this investigative approach. But then you've also taken things out of just like experiential world and into the academic world, and you've gotten your PhD. Can you tell me about that? Like, what was your journey to getting your PhD? What's your
sure.
PhD on? I don't think I even actually
Yeah.
know this. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so obviously, I was still in the police when I was busy with my master's degree, right? So I'll just start there.
Mm,
Just a master's degree in forensic investigation. It was really on stranger rape. Now,
mm,
stranger rape is a subgroup of rapists which is unknown to the victim,
yeah.
and it's usually within your stranger rape community where serial rape happen.
Hmm.
Where you find things like a signature and a fantasy. And these are very specific definitions of what a signature and a fantasy is, and we won't go into that now. But it's in that community where you often have paraphilias, right?
Mm,
Right? Coprophilia, europhilia, pedophilia.
hmm.
Um, so I completed that in 2011, and obviously, by then I was in the throes of all things human trafficking. So my PhD was on investigating human trafficking for sexual exploitation, and using a complex systems theoretical lens, and really looking at the issue, both the criminal system and the response system, as complex systems, and what makes them work, what makes them agile, and really coming to the conclusion, really, that in order for us to combat this issue effectively, we need to create a system that
Mm.
looks remarkably similar
Oh,
to the one
interesting.
that perpetrates. In from an agility perspective, the way that
Yeah, what does
they
that mean? So it needs to be
okay.
agile.
Yeah, well, so complex systems, there's a few tenets of what a complex system is. The first thing, it is built up of numerous different parts of a
Hmm.
system. And so what works on the criminal side of things is that They are able at the drop of a hat to self-organize. They work on relations of convenience.
Mm.
Today I use it, tomorrow I don't.
Hmm.
There is this intuitive understanding that we are all in this to make money at
Hmm.
any cost. So we know who the people are who's doing the money laundering, who's doing the guns, who's doing the endangered species where it comes to animals, who's doing the human beings. And it's the same pipeline. So there's almost this implicit knowledge of how the system works. When do we smell a rat that is a policeman? When
Hmm.
do we when do we perceive a threat? Practicing peripheral visioning, constantly aware of our surroundings, and knowing how to manipulate, knowing how what trauma bonding looks like. All
Hmm.
of these things. So you apply complex systems principles to that, and then you think about ourselves. Where are our limits as a movement, and where do we need to adapt? So kind of mirroring, but in a good way. So
Hmm.
what do they do that works, and how do we mirror those abilities, but to counter that, and
Yeah.
ultimately creating a hostile environment for sex trafficking and sex buying to thrive.
Hmm.
So, and that's kind of where the complex systems thinking went
That's so
into
fascinating.
that. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. I'll be curious how you think we're doing. Like, how do you think the movement to fight sexual exploitation is doing at
Mhm.
mirroring those things? Are we agile enough? Do we self-organize enough?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a great question. I think we are not there yet. I
Hmm.
think there's still a lot of things that needs to be done. Uh, what I do think about what we do here at NCOSE is very, very strategic in the sense that we approach the entire system of sexual exploitation, right?
Mm.
So we understand that none of these issues, whether it's pornography, child and child sexual abuse, sex trafficking, none of this exists in its own private universe. It's like a
Hmm.
diamond, you have to pick the diamond up, you have to flip it around, you have to turn it around, and it's got different shades and different dimensions to the problem. And I think because we address all of these different issues, you see different dimensions to a problem. You see the different elements that cords them together.
Hmm.
And I think therein lies a big part of the success. And then obviously our different strategies, having different angles to approaching the problem. So I think we do really good. I
Hmm.
remember when I was a law enforcement officer, we always said the bad guys has got all the money and no rules.
I
And
see.
the good guys have got all the rules but no money, right? And I do think, though, that with technology and artificial intelligence and us and the democratization really of technology and these tools, that we are now finally are able to go toe to toe with the opposition. So
Mm.
I think it's time for the movement for us to just do an honest assessment. Where are we? And
Mhm.
what are the things that we need to kind of recalibrate? Um, so we're not there yet,
Yeah.
but I do know that we are all in the arena, and where we are as Nicosia, I'm so excited about where we are and where we are going.
Yes.
So yeah.
You came from South Africa to the US, and you joined NCOSE, and you've been here for years. Some people have seen your name on blogs and op-eds and journal articles. But before you stepped into this role, you were a bit more behind the scenes working on our influence in academia and research, making sure that we had that strong information foundation. Could you just share a little bit about why did you come to the National Center on Sexual Exploitation out of all the places? And
Mm.
yeah, just that journey and kind of how it's been as you've
Sure. So
gotten.
I've always, I mean, in the middle 2000, I became very much involved in this whole pushback against this lie of full decriminalization,
Mm.
right? This fleeting promises of a decriminalized sex trade. And, I think it's probably one of the biggest, just, it's just a nauseating lie
Yeah.
that's been proffered that men should be able to purchase sexual access and that the sex trade can be rewarding, and it's just a big lie. And so I've done a lot of work on that front over the years, and I came across some of Nikosi's work. I
Mm.
think it was in the 2015, 2016. It was kind of in that era, maybe a year or two later. And when I saw the web of sexual exploitation, I was like, yes, they get
Oh,
this.
that's so great. I
I
didn't
was
know this.
I was like,
I
it
love
just
that web
oh,
graphic.
it's just
Yeah,
so
it just shows
intuitive.
it.
It's just
Yeah.
so
Hmm.
intuitive, and it makes practical, intuitive sense
Hmm.
in letter and in spirit.
Hmm.
It just makes sense, and I was like, wow, this and it obviously my work with complex systems, training law enforcement officers, different parts of the world on a systems approach to criminal investigation and prosecuting these cases. And then seeing this web, I was like, that is just perfect, that just makes sense. So, and then, yes, and I met our public policy team in 2019 when I was here in the States. I did some work here and met with Eleanor. And then it was in 2020 that I got an opportunity to be on a call with you and Lisa.
I remember that call. Yeah.
And that was just an introduction by our mutual friend Ryan in South
Mhm.
Africa. And yeah, and just the next thing led
Yeah.
to the next. And I think just to summarize the answer to that, it's just that is just from all my experiences in practice, from crime scenes to courts, that is the only approach that works. It's got an evidence-based, it's undergirded by evidence, and it's got a methodical, that's just the only way to
Hmm.
address this holistically.
Yeah.
So, and it was just, what better place to be part of a
It
team
was
at. So,
incredible. I remember
yeah.
getting off of that phone call with you when we first met you and
Mm,
talking with Lisa and others on our team, just saying,
mm,
wow, this guy really is like
mm,
he gets it. Because for very many people who don't have the experience of kind of seeing it enact
mm,
in real life, it takes some time to kind of learn and understand. I do think that web graphic does really show it. Maybe we'll try to have a link somewhere in the show notes so people can go and look at it if they haven't seen it yet. But
mm,
and then then you've been here, you've been growing up, I know, working on our research department,
mm,
working on academia, like multiple journal articles that we've been getting
mm,
out lately. And now as our president and CEO, we can kind of start looking forward more
mm,
because there's still, like you said, a lot to do, a lot to
mm,
accomplish. What
mm,
would you say, our mission remains the same?
mm.
Whenever there's a new president or CEO, I think people ask, well, is your mission the same?
Yeah.
To the of mass scale prevention.
Mm,
Could you speak a bit towards our mission
mm.
and kind of the vision of where you see NCOSE going?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that we are building on a 62-year legacy. And I think over the 6 decades, I think NCOSE has seen how these different forms of exploitation, obviously a lot of this started with the issue of pornography,
Mhm.
but over the years, how NCOSE has learned more about the harms and how these issues manifest. Um, and what the tactics and the strategies are that is needed to approach this. I think a lot of that has been refined,
Mhm.
over a period of six decades. And I think a lot of a lot of what Nicosia has done, and especially talking about our issues, been a lot very aspirational, and we continue to be
Yeah.
aspirational, right? We want to build on that, but I do think society now is at this critical inflection point. Some of it has to do with what has happened over the last 3 years with the explosion of artificial intelligence, where traditional systems of sexual exploitation is now
Mm.
supercharged by AI.
Mhm.
And coming to our earlier conversation about complex systems, well, this is a time for us to self-organize. That's
Mhm.
one of the tenets. It's okay, we need to self-organize because the opposition is running ahead, and and I think that's where we are now, is refining what we're doing, but being far more bolder and
Mhm.
in the arena. I mean, we are not talking about we are going to break the system of sexual exploitation, right?
Yes.
And we are going to be more bolder. The gloves are off, and why are we bolder? Well, because the needle is moving
Mhm.
and the cracks are showing in the pornography system. I mean, part of
Yes.
our goals and part of our strategic plan is seeing that, breaking or having the pornography system crumble and creating a cultural rejection against that. And now we can really see that's
Yeah.
happening. We've seen our work with the Senate Judiciary Committee meetings. We were in the room when Mark Zuckerberg turned around and he apologized to parents. We were in the room where some of the senators, Lindsey Graham said to Mark Zuckerberg, I remember that. I still hear and
Mhm.
see Lindsey Graham's face saying, "You've got blood on your hands."
Mhm.
And we had many of those parents. It was here in the office
Yeah.
with the pictures of, the Forever 15s and the Forever
Mhm.
17s. And I vividly remember when the parents came into the room, the silent protest, but this tangible visual feeling of this is what power looks like.
Mhm.
And fairly recently, I think Josh Hawley said that this is what big tech fears,
Yeah.
is power in the hands of parents. So that's what we are doing here at NCOSE now. So yeah, and I think it's from our criminal court to Capitol Hill. If we're talking about multinational corporations,
Mhm.
it's changing, shifting a culture and changing policy and societal norms and values, changing the bad ones, but creating the a best standard for what that ought to look like,
Yes.
to ring fence and to buffer against, the things that we fight against. So, and just this movement,
Mhm.
it's continually building that, and also just helping people see that victory is on the horizon.
Mhm.
It really is,
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Those are just the perfect words to stand on. Victory is on the horizon.
yeah.
And Marcel, thank you so much for joining for this episode. Thank you so much for your leadership at NCOSE. It really is an incredible blessing to be working with you in this new role. And I just already see so many things are happening. We sometimes have kind of victory focused
Mm,
podcast episodes, and those are just going to become more and more frequent
mm.
with this boldness that we're able to address on these issues. So
Great.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Haley. Thanks for
Of
everything.
course. Thank
Mm,
you, everyone. And please make sure to follow, subscribe, like, and share.
mm.
Thank you.